Since this is the first seminar of the term, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you all and just to go over the calendar quickly because I've had lots of volunteers and I just want to make sure I haven't mixed up any of the dates. So the next lecture after today is September 27th will be Jeremy Eichler, who couldn't make it today. Then October 4th is Tom Chevalier. October 11th is Christian Ibsen. October 18th, Katja Buring. October 25th, Vasilis Monastiriotis. November 1st, Regine Paul. November 8th, Yezgi Ildiz. November 15th, John Stewart. November 29th, Ivana Isailovich. The 22nd, by the way, is Thanksgiving holiday, so there won't be any meeting that day. And December 6th is Ivana Stratner. So I hope I haven't made any mistakes in that list. And if there are any of you who have not yet signed up and want to speak in the first semester, there are only a couple of dates remaining, so get in touch with me as soon as possible. It's my pleasure today to introduce Albert Doja, who's a professor of sociology and anthropology at the University of Lille in France, and a member of the National Academy of Sciences in Albania, where he holds the first chair of anthropology. He earned his PhD in anthropology in 1993 from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in France, and he is an honorary fellow of the Department of Anthropology at the University College London, and served as founding vice chancellor of the new University of Durrës in Albania. He has held academic positions in France, Britain, Ireland, and Albania. Today, he will speak to us about the morphodynamics of European identity transformations, cultural encounters, core values, and migration challenges to European integration. So, Albert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. To begin with, I am very honored to open this series, the first time of the lecture in this seminar for CS Visiting Scholar. And I am also very thankful to the Center for European Studies to admit me in this program and provide me the opportunity to be part of the Harvard community. If you remember the first day, before going to look what it means to a freshman to touch the John Harvard's foods, I came at Harvard through the Massachusetts Avenue, and I first stopped at MIT, where so many things are being done on quantum theory, artificial intelligence, and to mention but the title of a book by Michael Fisher of MIT on anthropological futures. Moving from one quarter to another, the mind is constantly up a storm that could push the limits of human performance and understanding. As a French-educated and a French-minded anthropologist, a memorable question came immediately to my mind from Marvin Minsky and his Society of Mind. What magical tricks make us intelligent? Quite naturally, I find myself asking, what is a magical trick that makes the research I am doing? What magical trick makes identity politics so powerful? Paraphrasing Marvin Minsky, the trick is that there is no trick. The research I am doing and the power of identity politics, or the importance of populism that is taking much of our debate nowadays, as we have seen last week at CS, stem from the vast diversity of people's minds, not from any single perfect principle, value, idea, or motivation. People's action and decision, like the research any of us is doing, emerge from conflicts and negotiation among societies of processes that constantly challenge one another. Quote from Marvin Minsky. Among other things, cognitive revolution is now a contemporary interdisciplinary effort to provide scientific answer to a long-standing epistemological question. It was born here, in this intellectually stimulating environment, as an important intellectual movement among some celebrated forefathers, the computer scientist Marvin Minsky, the psychologist Jerome Bruner, the linguist Noam Chomsky, and the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. For Lévi-Strauss, since human brains are themselves natural objects, and since they are substantially the same throughout the species of Homo sapiens, we must suppose that when cultural products are generated, the process must impart to them certain universal natural characteristic of the brain itself. In this way, in investigating the elementary structures of cultural phenomena, we are also making discovery about the nature of humankind. Verbal categories, or what we say today, discursive categories, provide the mechanism through which universal structural characteristics of human brains are transformed into universal structural characteristics of human culture. In this way, category formation in human being follow universal natural paths. It is not that it must always happen the same way everywhere, but that the human brain is so constructed that it is predisposed to develop categories of a particular kind in a particular way. The epistemological issue of anthropological knowledge and the ethical conception of the anthropologist's work are constantly present throughout Lévi-Strauss' work in its ontological, etiological, and even salvational dimension, as he dealt with both the nature and the denaturation of humankind and society, trying to return to the mean, or better, showing the absence of means to alleviate the evils. Clearly, it is his own adroitness and talent to have been able to establish the theoretical foundation of a revolutionary contribution, both scientific and humanistic, to general anthropology. Contrary to the received ideas of his critics, little of recent topical, ethical, methodological, or epistemological interest escaped Lévi-Strauss' notice, understanding, and engagement. His corpus of work is far-reaching and comprehensive in scope, encompassing methodology, philosophy, history, humanism, mythology, linguistics, aesthetics, cognition, and reasoning. Indeed, Claude Lévi-Strauss anticipated that called for the advent of what I believe must be the future of a theoretical anthropology. He is hailed as a hero of our time by Susan Sontag and many others since the early 1960s. And his vision and ambition was to provide a new epistemology and a new ethics, a new approach to methodology, and a new global awareness. While revisiting the old debate between Derrida and Lévi-Strauss on the place of writing, I came to the conclusion that we must legitimately ask to what extent, at least in the popular imagination, a version of structuralism invented retrospectively by post-structuralists has become substituted for the real thing. Anthropology today concerns itself with the question of identity politics, migration, disease, famine, poverty, feminism, reflexivity, corruption, illiberalism, globalism, ethnic conflict, civil war, human rights, cultural activism, fundamentalism, terrorism, and many other related things. An attempt to restore Lévi-Strauss to a central position can hardly prove immediately relevant to all of these social and political issues. Yet it is possible to show that structural anthropology may innovatively account for much more than the dynamics of social system and the praxis of competitive and strategic practices. Yet, some of Lévi-Strauss' achievement could lay strong claim to having mapped within anthropology the philosophical parameter of an increasing preoccupation with issues of contextualization and reflexivity in the face of declining grand meta-narrative and grand theory, as well as with issues of political concern and engagement in the post-colonial era. We may be correct in asserting that Lévi-Strauss used structural argument coherently and correctly to analyze the cultural order, its transient character by means of entropy and irreversibility, and not surprisingly, deconstruction or rather dissolution, to use its own term, and self-reflexivity. I have been fortunate enough to meet Lévi-Strauss in person. When I met him for the first time during a party in the impressive library of the Social Anthropology Laboratory where I did my PhD, I presented him some Albanian ethnographic data in a very typical way, that is, thinking I had something to tell that could interest him. I remember there was something about the motifs of Albanian medieval ballads, warrior songs, customary laws, social organizations, and things like that. Surely, he paid particular attention to my matter, seemingly out of courtesy. But I remain grateful for his critical encouragement of my rather untypical theorizing attitude, which I will have to develop later. I was talking about the possibility of linking my stuff to incest prohibition theory and structural analysis of myth with the aim of revealing the hidden ideologic dimension and instrumental character of social value like honor, morality. My purpose was to point at the silencing of human agency, in particular women agency, under the appearance of structural coherence. Was he still listening just out of courtesy, especially to my critical yet insufficiently developed ideas of the interactive relationship between structure and agency? No doubt. Yet guess what? When I met him again 10 years later, not only had nothing forgotten of what I told him 10 years later, but he also infallibly remembered my own theoretical position almost with the same term, a discussion which we continued through a number of exchanging letters together afterward. Nevertheless, I remained an inconstant disciple. There was a time in my anthropological training when, educated in France in the 1990s, I found Lévi-Strauss simultaneously inspiring and terrifying, which ultimately convinced me of the superiority of what I have learned. In the next phase, after moving to Britain in 2000 to take up a lectureship at the University of Hull, all my anthropological knowledge gained in the French tradition of anthropology was so challenged by various British American postmodern approaches of the time, as I reached to the point that I had everything to learn from the beginning. But with maturity, I came to see that with Lévi-Strauss there is perhaps more truth in the next than in the previous side of my anthropological education. Arguably, some aspect of Lévi-Strauss theory may be advanced as a workable methodology, helping us to build innovative anthropological approaches to agency and politics in history, culture, and society. One of the more powerful of Lévi-Strauss' ideas is his description of the generative engine of myths on the basis of the set of their own transformation. In mythical thinking, the basic transformation that Lévi-Strauss distinguished between a number of character or term of myths and their large number of possible roles or functions are controlled by means of a special relationship that he formulated in a canonical way, which demonstrates how the transformation of the myth can be captured. Lévi-Strauss' concept of canonical formulation that articulate the transformational dynamics of mythical networks transcend a simple analogical relation to a quadratic equation of the kind that you see on the board, which articulate a dynamic homology between meaningful elements and their propositional function. The formulation made it possible for Lévi-Strauss to detect a sort of genuine logical machine generative of open-ended meaning within specified mythical network. In a quadratic equation of this kind, the generative virtues of the so-called double twist of the canonical transformation in the structural study of myth implies two conditions. If, as you see there, maybe it is difficult to see, but according to Lévi-Strauss, a formulation of this type reflects a group of transformation in which it is assumed that a relation of equivalence exists between two situations, defined respectively by an inversion of terms and relations, provided the one of the term is replaced by its opposite and that a correlative inversion is made between the function value and the term value of two elements. People that can read a mathematical equation may understand. At any case, this is very difficult to grasp, and it was much more difficult when it was announced. Actually, this formulation has been announced by Lévi-Strauss in an American top journal in 1955 in English, and it is left non-understood for a while. And he finished almost all his massive work without people could understand what he was talking. He never forget what he's doing, and he has done all the mythological work having in mind this kind of operation. It took time to new mathematics to develop up to the point as to discover that this formulation was an anticipated formulation, anticipated model of catastrophe models, which in new mathematics were discovered in the 70s, where Lévi-Strauss finished his work. After the 70s, the Lévi-Strauss came again with great pomp in academia as a great discovery of the century. But what is important, and this one is much more easy to understand, for a catastrophic operation of this kind to take place, the very idea of canonical relations requires a third operating condition, which is external to canonical formulation, external to this formula. In Lévi-Strauss' structure of myth, this condition remains again implicit and never articulated. In all cases, however, it is expressed as the necessity of the crossing of a spatio-temporal boundary, defined in territorial, ecological, linguistic, cultural, social, and whatever term, but which is always a boundary condition in mathematical sense, required to be satisfied at the boundary of a topological domain in which a set of differential equations is to be solved. The catastrophist operation that requires a boundary condition of this kind is claimed by Lévi-Strauss to be important in determining the mathematical solution to various mythical problems. Namely, quite simply, a series of variations in the myth of a given people cannot be fully understood without going through myths belonging to another people, which are in a relation of inverse transformation with the former. This great discovery of Lévi-Strauss made it possible for structural anthropology to overcome the logic of binary opposition, to which it is too often and obstinately reduced, in order to become a morphogenetic dynamics. In a broad sense, while the key categories that Lévi-Strauss developed are embodied in the anthropological object he studied, myths and mythical network, they have the potential to be usefully and critically applied to other domains if radically tweaked. Many studies, and the list in the literature is very long, show that the structural analysis initiated by Lévi-Strauss may innovatively account for the ways in which social relations are even more mediated by and implicated in broader political processes. In this wake, my original idea is to argue that the requirement of a boundary condition in canonical formalization can anticipate the discursive activation of a particular cultural ideology acting as a given agency of instrumental politics. Let me illustrate briefly with 3 cases of some now accomplished and some other ongoing research project. A common typical issue of Balkan ethnography, especially Albanian ethnography, is the view that associates patriarchal cultural trait with high fertility rates, extended family structure, marriage patterns, and the cultural myth and ideology of honor and blood. Without disputing the notion of the Albanian family system being patriarchal, it seems that the cultural myth and the ideology associated with patrilineality are conflated with the actual practices of patriarchy. Many commentators have too easily assumed that the patriarchal language and discourses that symbolically support patrilineality result uniformly in outcome and practices that they simply reify as patriarchal. I took up a more careful reading and systematic critical analysis of demographic data, historical sources, and ethnographic evidence to show that the Albanian family is confronted since a long time with particularly low fertility rate and with a relatively high average age at marriage for women, which cannot support the assumption of a particular patriarchal extended family. Arguably, a more analytical approach to the alleged segmentary organizational system of parallel agnatic groups of men in Southeast European societies, including Albania, would also reveal that the segmentary structure of social organization appeared to be inadequate. A morphological approach and transformational analysis can show that the ideological construction of these myths can be invalidated if we take what is put forward as empirical evidence is nothing more than a strong cultural activism acting as a kind of cultural Viagra for social survival. In this situation, cultural pressure subjugates both women and men to the reproduction of social norms and value, aiming at limiting Albanian women to their childbearing function and Albanian men to their protecting function. In this way, the cultural activism commonly obscures an important fact of a purely ideological dimension, which could be only uncovered after mapping the overall data within a canonical formalization of morphodynamic approach and transformational analysis. Last year, excuse me, last year, at a conference on war and sexual violence held at CUNY Graduate Center in New York, which resulted in a forthcoming edited volume, I presented another highly topical case that is even more explicit. Feminist and other accounts of war rapes during the ethnic conflicts in former Yugoslavia and elsewhere have exposed extensively the importance of misogynistic masculinity, preparing the ground for an ahistorical approach, which has also reified a conceptualization of so-called backward Balkan social structure, norms, and values. A common way of approaching the dimension of mass rapes and sexual violence during the sinisterly notorious ethnic conflict in former Yugoslavia has been to explain them specifically against a cultural background supported by the existence of a tribal society, complex joint family structure known as Zadruga in South Slavic area, customary laws known as Kanun in North Albanian area, patriarchal practices, and other savage customs. This is not only obscure, but also unscrupulous. If we look closely to social and family structure, both marriage and vanjas or feud rest on the symbol of blood, and both are institutions that give shape to alliances. If marriage created a network of alliances and divided society in exogamous groups, feud also created a continuously moving scenario in which membership and strategic alliances constantly change and coagulate the consistency of agnatic groups. Clearly, matrimonial affinity and hospitality on the one hand, and feud and hostility on the other hand, were interchangeable categories insofar as they were always a relation of mutual obligation and constraint. In general, a relation of matrimonial affinity and hospitality was experienced as a relationship of friendship and solidarity, just as a relation of feud was lived as a relation of hostility. Yet, if matrimonial affinity and feud were opposed to one another as much as many other structural modalities of association or dissociation between different agnatic groups, friendship and hostility were part of the same opposition. Matrimonial affinity and feud vanjas, friendship and hostility were only different expression of a single and unique structural relationship. Definitely, the whole of social relations and values remain placed under the sign of ambivalence. In this sense, at a more empirical level, emotional sentiment as well as social relation and value of affinity, friendship, and hospitality must have something in common with a relationship of love and solidarity to hatred and disintegration. Precisely this kind of structural ambivalence may allow a new theoretical and methodological approach to explain the effectiveness of mass rape as a military strategy of ethnic cleansing in former Yugoslavia. Marriage is a transaction of women exchanged between agnatic groups of men, a customary transaction intended to seal political alliances and cancel debt of blood, honor, or money. In this sense, marriage is not only a social institution of sexual relations, but also a sexual regulation of social violence and a sexual institution of social stability. Also, rape as a forced sexual intercourse is not a simple aggressive expression of sexuality, but rather a sexual expression of social violence. From the position of structural logic, marriage becomes possible by the means of matrimonial alliance that is supposed to bring love, friendship, and solidarity. In the same way, rape can be defined as a confrontational misalliance that becomes possible by the means of war and which would necessarily induce hatred, hostility, and disintegration. This is not, however, to understand women's experience of rape and marriage in a binary and rigid structuralist relation, because there is necessarily a problem with this argument that is inspired from Aristotle's logic of analogy, which cannot be valid. The permutational relation between indexical term and function value of both rape and marriage may be productively mapped onto a catastrophic model following Lévi-Strauss morphodynamic theory. Indeed, not only war is a catastrophe, but also rape in war is a catastrophe in its own. Accordingly, we may offer a catastrophic model to conceptualize rape by means of a canonical formalization in which the solidarity role of marriage will stand to the hostility of rape as the ambivalence of marriage stand to the rape politics of an unspeakable and unthinkable solidarity upside down or anti-solidarity. And you have an application of the same formula here. Here, rape is replaced forcibly by marriage, its opposite, and a correlative inversion is made between the functional ambivalence of marriage and the unknown, unspeakable ontology of an enforced rape function. Yet, for a catastrophic operation of this kind to take place, the logical operation of a boundary condition is required. In a context in which mass rape was deliberately used as a possible instrument of ethnic cleansing, everything happened as if the activation of a specific political and instrumental agency was necessary for the notorious effectiveness of mass rape to take place. This kind of ideological agency, which is mathematically identified by the requirement of a boundary condition in canonical formalization, can be shown to promote and put forward the cultural assumptions that are specific to a given group. During the Bosnian War and the Kosovo War in former Yugoslavia, this specific agency was provided by the increasing role of traditionalist and nationalist discourses, which burst moral order and social morphology in the first place, precisely by bringing to the fore the destructive working of family honor and blood ideology. Indeed, the mass rapes of women were intended to forcefully instill a kind of shame and disgrace as a social pollution that should bring necessarily the disorder and breakup of the social system of any group in its totality. Typically at war, such a social pollution and catastrophic disorder is termed in Albania with a generic term for total killing, Shfarosie, which means literally kinship uprooting. Returning to paraphrased Lévi-Strauss terminology from the raw and the cooked, the unspeakable political effectiveness of mass rape is forwarded to account not just for the raw madness of cultural norm and values. It is mainly the twist of a cooked evil of ideological agency acting as an instrumental politics of ethnic cleansing. The cultural activism of family honor and blood ideology makes it possible afterwards for family norms and value to be converted into ethnic religious ideology, for ethnicity to be converted into nationalist consciousness, for this consciousness to become organized into conflict, and for organized nationalists to become militarist, masculinist, misogynist, racist, violent, and the rest. The requirement of an operating condition that in the study of myth is expressed as a boundary condition in mathematical sense may be of particular interest in the study of identity transformation. In the comparative analysis of transformation resulting from intercultural dynamics, especially in processes of identity construction and identity politics. This brings me to my last case, that is my research proposal on the morphodynamic of European identity transformation that I intend to develop during my stay at Harvard as a CS visiting scholar, and which aimed at reinvigorating neo-structural constructivism to turn the focus toward more profoundly political implication. Social relations are often weird and counterintuitive. Especially in the identity field, discursive practices do not always have definite ontological properties. They often appear to be entangled in strange combination of seemingly incompatible states of either societal, ethnic religion, and national populist, or civic and normative characteristic. In this sense, identity ontologies can be compared with a seemingly mysterious state of particles that in quantum mechanics is called superposition. Both MIT and French physicists are conducting real-life tests of whether quantum particles truly exist in superposition states. I assume that a comparable quantum connection to be tested may also exist in the identity field between seemingly opposed and incompatible identity ideas, values, and motivation. The main assumption is that identity transformation are affected by seemingly opposite cultural ideology that are in inverse relationship to one another and that act as political instrument of power and hegemony. On empirical level, I assume that European integration is never complete and unstable relations subsist between civic ideas and societal motivation. In terms of research design, logical processes and political tension must be explored in relation to identity shifting at societal, ethnic, religious, regional, national, and supranational levels, European level, in other words. In many situations, discursive practice are not necessarily positioned to provide a particular identity meaning, as the observer in social research, just as in quantum mechanics, influence what they observe. This only becomes clear once we look what they mean. Incompatible identities may become deeply connected as their property match in opposition to one another when they are observed and mapped. Here it is important that the distinction between indexical term and functional value of the identity field is conceptualized topologically as relational, not substantial. This means that relative position of identity indexes, kinds, agents, units, or ontologies are determined by a structured set of power relation and group identities that achieve their own transformation through identity politics. Actually, whatever its properties, any identities is only applicable in reference to anotherness and can only be realized on the boundary of one in contact or confrontation with or in contrast to the other. In this sense, civic ideas and ethnic motivation appear to exist in a quantum superposition state and possess multiple conflicting meaning at once. If they are entangled in this way, like in quantum mechanics, I predict that when the cultural position of ethnic motivation is revealed, for example, both civic and ethnic or other identity will fall into exact opposed position of instrumental ideologies. Here I assume that the identity field is again comparable with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics, given that the more exactly the cultural position of identity values and aims is determined, the less exactly the identity momentum of policy outcome can be known. Indeed, the wave-particle duality in quantum physics might be thought as the multiplex relationship, multiplex interaction in the identity field between civic ideas and societal motivation. On conceptual level, I assume that this instability reveals an apparent risk of discursive activation of hidden instrumental politics and ideological agency that could promote ethnicization of European values and unsuspected outcome of public policies. A neostructural model of the identity field is expected to capture it, based on the evolution rules of canonical transformation defined by Lévi-Strauss and the concept of political field borrowed from Pierre Bourdieu, which might know a little bit more. In Bourdieu field theory, power relations are reframed as lines of forces in an electromagnetic field, and social space as a multiplicity of relatively autonomous fields. In the European identity field, the dynamics of interaction show that discursive practices support or reject modalities of belonging that conform to public logics, which are instrumentally used to affect identity building and transformation. While potential political tensions in the reproduction of identity field restrict or encourage boundary crossing, I assume that any transgression generates a hysteresis effect, which is mathematically calculable in electromagnetic and other fields, and which can explain identity politics as a system of identities depending on the history of their own transformation. Further logical mathematical reformulation of Lévi-Strauss methodology can provide logical formalization of transformational regularities in concrete situation of identity field, which may allow taking hold of a generative engine of identities based on their own transformation. This would mean, for example, that the double sequence of doing good to your natives or friends and doing harm to foreigner is complemented by another double sequence of doing harm to natives as if you were doing good to strangers already ignored and inexistent. This may seem to be weird, but it is what's happened more often than not, especially with public policy twisted by populist arguments. Mapping the interaction between identity terms and function onto permutational relation between identity indexes, function, kind, agent, unit, and ontologies and ideologies also reflect their position in the identity field, while reformulating their topological relationship in canonical way will demonstrate how identity transformation can be captured and instrumental agency behind identity politics can be revealed. For example, computer simulation of the normative function of civic identity will be confronted to the societal, ethnic, religious, nationalist, populist, fundamentalist function of cultural identities. Ideally, this confrontation is supposed to bring the transformation of cultural identity into normative functional identity. Yet, canonical formulation, according to this formula of what I said, also demonstrate whether normative function of civic identity is transformed into ambivalent agency as political faction or societal group could characterize a hidden, unsuspected European identity or the ethnicity of an upside-down Europe. Remember that in the structural study of myth, an additional operation condition is required as a boundary condition in both empirical and mathematical sense. In the identity field, this validation requirement must lead us to search for hidden instrumental agencies of identity politics and ideology that could constrain identity transformation in one or another direction. Finally, narrative references of indexical term and functional value in coded category of identity discursive practices and modeling validation of their subliteral meanings provide or could provide precise indication to hidden realities that characterize empirical situation of either ethnicization of socio-cultural relation or Europeanization of societal, ethnic, religious, regional, national values. The target is here to deliver a computational model to conceptualize and recursively map the determinant of civic solidarity and intercultural attitude, which allow developing a policy instrument to assess how core values and identity transformation may evolve as boundary condition of European integration, social cohesion, and intercultural dynamics. On methodological level, I hope to develop this research project in collaboration with potentially interested Harvard faculty, anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, computer scientists, and mathematicians. We need a heavy infrastructure design of computational models and protocols based on Bayesian inference, Dev's formalism, and construction of systemic numeric references to identity discursive practices. In practical terms, we'll explore the role of metaphoric and dichotomous aspect of discursive practices and the functional relationship they suggest in identity categorization. Functional shifts are assumed depending on whether the same metaphors of gender kinship or building and construction are used. We build the house of Europe, in other words, or the edifice we are building, or the relationship we have all as Europeans, and so on. Kind of metaphor used in identity discourses. So the functional shifts are assumed depending on whether the same metaphors are used as indexical terms of identity expression or as instrumental function of identity politics. The differential discontinuity between indexical terms and function value in the identity field is a logic of dichotomization and permutation in metaphorical and metonymic series. Open series of antithetical pairs of identity indexes, kind, agents, unit, and ontologies, and the permutation of their indexical and functional value are available to any agent across identity field to be pinned conspicuously on identity kind of various reference units, be they individual, societal groups, nation state, institution, organization, and so on. We'll identify non-exhaustive series of ontological assumption of identity objectified in terms of indexical evidence referring to supposed origin, common cultural heritage, collective memory, language, religion, socio-legal norms, institutional political system, media, citizenship, sovereignty, federation of the identity unit under consideration. They allow configuring metaphorical metonymic permutation of discursive practices that force instrumental function of identity building to compel identity transformation. We assume that such functional values, recognition, socialization, distribution, diffusion, participation, persuasion, emulation, manipulation, imposition, discrimination, claim, negotiation, and contestation relate to actors' ontological assumption and motivation, and thus they identify the subjective agency of underlying identity politics. Computer-assisted textual analysis and agentive algorithm of discursive surveys will disaggregate literal meaning of narrative text into multiple descriptors that make up and objectify indexical terms of identity expression and their functional value in identity politics. Their coding in subliteral numeric references to indexical terms of characteristic, performances, and affiliation will create multiple data set to map the distribution of identity situation and relation into constructed category according to their function value of either common refuge of close belonging or separate cluster of open inclusiveness. Second, the presence or absence of indexical term of behavioral component, conviction, and attitude relating to corresponding function value of identity politic. Third, the permutation of indexical term into functional value and vice versa. And finally, the identification of factors affecting such distribution and permutation with respect to social, cultural, and political order. In any case, as I said, I hope to develop this project in collaboration with who is interested. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. This was a challenging talk with which to begin our series. In some ways, I feel I should be your ideal audience because my PhD is in mathematics. Catastrophe theory figures in my dissertation, and I've translated Lévi-Strauss. And yet, I have a hard time putting together the examples that you gave with the theoretical superstructure in which you're embedded. So, to start the discussion, I'd like to ask you to be more concrete about some aspect of what you intend to do. For example, you said you had in mind to do a computer simulation of national identity. Could you tell us a little more about what that means? I have a hard time even grasping how you would operationalize that.
Right. This was the very last part of my talk, which is still on the way of being designed. On methodological level, I pointed to some possibilities which must be developed in strong collaboration with computer scientists and mathematicians. And as I said, it is impossible to make a computer simulation of identity politics. My take is that we could make a computer simulation of discursive practice after they are coded in indexical term and functional value, how they permute. So, in other words, this part of the project is really a project, and it is not a research yet. So, a number of descriptors, a number of narrative numerical references to narrative discourses has to be done first before we can hope that the computer simulation of identity politics could be done and could be a realistic endeavor.
Okay, Rishi?
Just with a question of specificity, what kind of data would you have in mind? Because you talked a lot about narratives and metaphors. So is this speeches you're thinking about, or kind of policy documents of the EU? What are you talking about? And then how will you leave it there?
As far as data are concerned, is open. My idea is open to any kind of data which are verbally constituted. So discourses, documents, data mining in social media as well. So the main process is to provide numerical references to discursive to narrative data. to put it more, because when you say discourse, to verbal or to narrative written on the token on the, or diffused on the internet, or also the official document produced by institution and organization, which can be screened for in order to see what are the metaphors used to push forward an identity agenda, and what are the metaphors and the twisting of the narrative data, not only to push but to hidden sometimes what is behind, and this is more important, I think.
Okay, since I'm trying to learn all your names, if you would identify yourself when you ask your question, you sir.
I'm Gary Irvin, chairman of the anthropology department. So as an anthropologist and as someone who was raised as a structuralist and then who went through the fires of post-structuralism, but still who has sympathy for structuralism and a special admirer of Lévi-Strauss, I'm very sympathetic to your project. I'm worried about it though, because as you know, as well as anyone, I mean, one of the things that happened with structuralism was that it fell under the suspicion that what structuralism was about was the clever naming of categories, and that when categories were named a certain way, then they were susceptible to a certain kind of analysis, to structural analysis. So I remember seeing one example of that under structuralism you no longer would call a meal of meat and potatoes, you would call it cow and not cow, right? So, I mean, it was playing with language, playing with metaphors, and so, like when you construct your models, when you derive your categories, and when they become names and words, how will you be sure that you're not falling, prey to this kind of gameplay of well-named categories, or conveniently named categories?
Well, first of all, I can guarantee you that I will never be sure. So, having said that, my whole endeavor is that I am trying to bring the structuralist endeavor toward more political concern, trying to what I said somewhere in my talk, that my only thing is that to think that the boundary condition required for the structural analysis of myth may be thought to maybe be pointing for us toward a kind of agency which is lacking in the structural picture as well. For what you say is, as I said, I can never be sure, but I can add that this danger is not only for structuralism. This danger is much more, I would say, ridiculous for post-structuralism, isn't it?
Thanks, so Vasilis, Albert, thanks for this. Not my area, but very stimulating. Also very difficult to follow at some point. So, if I understood correctly, the main premise, and I stay with the example of the mass rapes in the Yugoslav war, and then we'll move on to your project. So the idea there is that it's not the individuals or the social norms of the individuals who are open to commit rape when the conditions allow them, during war, but it's also sort of looking at it through the prism of an equilibrium that actually in good times produces marriage and distribution through particular institution, and then the same thing you can double invert it into mass rape as a form of competition and ethnic cleansing and things. Now, there's a question that I would ask is, how can you actually verify that empirically? Because it's in a way a myth, a narrative that you also say, but I don't see the falsification of it. And maybe defining the boundary condition will help, but we didn't see it, not even in the generic form. But then if we take this as a potential criticism, then if you move that to the European identity politics level, then I think you're going from something which is quite basic, even though the role of family and everything in the Balkans is not very basic, but to something which is definitely very complex, and is also very much conditioned on policy, on current policy. So if you want, the way I understand it is that you have many layers where all these things may be playing out. So if you want, not only you have the F function, but you have many, many functions on that. So even if it is kind of potentially possible to develop the algorithm, for the case of the mass rapes in former Yugoslavia, I think it's even technically, but also conceptually impossible to do it in a multidimensional space where, not only how I relate with beliefs or how I relate with my material conditions affects my position, my identity politics, but it's also even a random statement, what Merkel said on Monday versus what happened on the border on Tuesday. So this then creates a complication that I think makes it definitively impossible to put that all in a computational model. But maybe I'm very precise.
Okay, to begin with the case of rapes. As you say, rape is, especially during ethnic conflict or war, is at the same time an individual and a collective thing. Now, my question is not why a rape happens in this situation. I left this question to be taken by all other that are treated on this issue. My question is why rape, everything being equal, became an effective instrument of ethnic cleansing. Because it is not enough to instill the individual or even collective trauma of rape. Something is needed for rape to be an effective instrument, an effective weapon. And this is the activation, the discursive activation of local ideologies, of cultural ideologies. It is because these people must protect their women and to have their prestige, to fight against the other, that make them weak if their women are raped. After all, if rape occurs like that, in the course of war, this can be managed. But this can never be managed if rape is accompanied by a, I would say, propaganda, by an ideological discursive that insists, that put the finger on that. And this agency of putting the finger on the where it is more painful, this is what makes rape as an effective instrument of ethnic cleansing. And I am not talking of rape as an effective instrument of undermining women or the gender. I don't see I leave aside the gender dimension here, and I take into consideration only the ideological dimension, which exacerbate the local value of blood and honor. Because local value of blood and honor, they never exist out there. They are just to be negotiated one way or another. people, when they say in this society, this is an honorable man, this does not mean that this guy will do everything to show you how good is honor protector. I can guarantee you that at all situations he will try to hide what he has done in order to not deflect his own honor. So you see, now if you push this to him, there is no choice for him to reveal what and to react and so. According to what you said, I agree completely that the picture became much more difficult, especially as we are talking here, or I would like to point here to the activation of some ideological processes that are hidden from consciousness. Not hidden, not necessarily hidden purposely, but they are hidden because we are not aware. I can give you just an example of last week we have talked a lot about populism, and the main concern of political scientists is making democracy from formal to real. Making democracy from formal to real, what does it mean? Launching debate, reinforcing civil society, and so on, participation, and things like that. And when populism came up, everyone is shocked. And in this situation, three options for me are possible. Either we don't understand very well what democracy means, or we don't understand what people mean, or what civil society mean, or we are wrong ourselves. In the three situations, behind us is an ideology which make us to think to take one of the three positions. My point here is to leave out there and to formalize this negotiation of ideologies that clash with each other without us being aware of, and trying to formalize all this, if I can, in order to point that if we take this behind this political behavior, behind this public policy, there is an agency which work in that direction. And if this agency work in that direction up to the end, the outcome of this behavior, of this policy, will be that or that. That is my greatest idea, I would say. I don't know if I would, because all depend on the last part of what I and Arthur mentioned. I have to design in collaboration. I insist on this. I can't do this on my own. I have just the idea. If this idea is taken, I will be able one day maybe to design this research in such a way as to give the result that I expect.
Yes.
Yeah, Christian Ibsen, University of Copenhagen. So, you know, I agree that it's probably it's a bit difficult question that you are asking here, but I think it's also commendable that you do take up a really big question about European identities. So one thing, Lajin, on your point about sources and what kind of analysis that you do. You mentioned Bourdieu and field theory, and so while I'm not a Bourdieu expert or anything like that, but it seems to me that if you want to take that route, what Bourdieu is about, is about capital distributions and relations between actors, and it really matters which actor is putting out which discourse, and you'll have more or less powerful actors doing that. So one way to start would be to sort of map the field of identity politics, if you will, and find really important actors in that field. How you want to do that is an entire analysis in itself, of course. But I think it would be really useful to really try to pin down which actors you want to speak into this identity politics field that you're talking about. And I guess also, and this is also always the criticism with discourse analysis, talk is cheap, and what matters is what people do, and that kind of thing. And one day Merkel is saying one thing, and the other she's saying another thing, and how do you really? So I think in terms of that, it would be great if you could somehow put discourse into time and sequences of time, and how narratives combine with each other as responses to each other. But I think some actors would be great in your analysis, and especially the powerful ones, I guess.
Well, I take this as a good suggestion, and I am thankful. So it is answered because there is no question, so it is a suggestion, very useful. As far as you said about the discursive, I agree completely with you, and to be honest, I am very suspicious of research design that are only based on what people say, surveys and things like that. As anthropologists, I think all anthropologists know that people and never say what they think and what they do. The question that anthropologists raise is why people say what they say, and that is one way of answering this question is exactly what I want to do.
Yes.
Here as well. My question was actually very similar to Christian's point. Basically, you've mentioned that you want to overcome the structuralism by including more agency. Yet we heard very traces of agency, and you brought this concept of instrumental agency behind the identity formulation. I find this very intriguing, and I was wondering, what do you mean by that? Is it related to what, as Christian suggests, is it certain actors pushing for certain things? And the other thing that was intriguing for me, that you mentioned things like civic ideas or social motivation, and you related to them quantum particles as if they exist out there, but a lot of them are constructed. I mean, how much of construction mechanism are going to factor in your analysis as well? And who is constructing them as well?
Well, now for the first question, because I think you asked two questions. For the first question, instrumental agency is what is behind identity politics, which is expressed through discourses, behaviors, and policies. So, if we look at the discourses, behaviors, and policies, we don't see the instrumental agency. But we may think that there is always behind an instrumental agency to push things in that or that direction. And with that I mean, my point is to be aware first of this, of the necessity of an instrumental agency at any time, and to point out to this agency which is often unsaid, hidden, unaware. Clear? The second question, now I forget the second question.
I mean, issues like civic ideas and social motivation, and the fact that you even find them resembling quantum particles.
Yeah, I say that, like in quantum mechanics, that the observer influences what is observed. Even in social relation, the observer influences what they observe in the sense that identity ontologies, assumption or whatever, make sense, or when we look what they mean. Normally, even without being aware, or even without saying that I am doing identity politics, normally people say one thing for another. For example, normally populist, fundamentalist use perfectly well the civic and normative discourse to push their populist and fundamentalist agendas. In this way, if we look only to the discourse they use, they are perfect. What's wrong with them? But we know very well that there is. Do you know how it is?
Can I interrupt with a thing about yesterday's Donald Trump's speech at the UN? The discourse he used was not sort of, the one that you wouldn't confuse it for the normal discourse. So am I so
I haven't
even
seen
Marine Le Pen,
I haven't.
Of course, they operate within parliamentary procedures and stuff, but
Just take a concrete example. When we listen to politicians, whoever the politician, let's not mention Trump or Marine Le Pen, whoever politician, we know, perhaps not most of the time, but very often, politicians tell bullshit. And everybody knows that. Do you think that the politicians don't know that? They are people like anyone. And if you point to that, they would say, this is politics. This is politics. What this does mean? This means that they have always an instrumental agency to push forward in mind, but they choose your own language. And if we analyze their own language, we'll never discover what is behind their mind. As simple as that.
Yes.
My name is Mark Carlson. I'm a non-academic economist, so I guess I'll have a fairly simple discourse here. My impression, ultimately, what we're trying to do here is to get a handle on the evolving and changing European identity. So my very simple question, which I will explain a bit more later, is do you see the European identity as becoming more European and less nationalistic, or more nationalistic and less European? When I was working in the 1990s in Southeastern Europe, in Albania and former Yugoslavia, it was very clear that the identity within Yugoslavia was becoming more nationalistic. People in Macedonia, people in Slovenia, everywhere. They had told me under Yugoslavia we had a much, let's say, softer national identity. At the same time, we live in an increasingly global world, which I would think would shrink this. Me personally, I'm a Boston, Albanian American boy. My identity is geographic, because I grew up in Braintree, the other end of the red line, in every sense of the word. Cultural, because I grew up in America. Linguistic, because I speak English, and then some Albanian now recently. And what was the fourth part of the identity? Cultural, linguistic, ethnic, and geographic. So these four things, which to me are all shrinking in this world and should make a sort of more mishmashy European generic identity over time. I realize this can take decades and centuries, so I'm just wondering what your opinions on that.
Well, to begin with European identity comparing to American identity, whatever American identity means is something which is almost non-comparable to European identity. Why? Because of the political situation, the federation, the United States, and there we have a disunion of state. We have a lot of things that don't militate for an European identity similar to American identity. But this is not possible. It depends on the situation. Because American identity was not as it is now some centuries ago. So, identity are changing and may change all the time. Now, where is going European identity? Honestly, nobody knows. And that is the necessity. It is necessary to have this kind of project to point out what is going on. As far as I am concerned, I don't expect to point that where is going European identity. My concern is to point some mechanisms which may stress or may influence the Europeanization of societal motivation or the ethnicization of normative values. They can be both. What is this mechanism that do that and that do not the other one, and vice versa? If I can be able to put the finger on this, I think it will be a great discovery.
And
Yeah, without anything like arts background from which to raise the questions. I guess I'll raise probably very naively. As you spoke, I wondered, well, coming to your analysis of rape as instrumental agency, is the mathematical formulation which you seek to develop in the computational model, is this mathematical, and what you said about quantum physics and so on and so on, are these mathematical formulations in physics and otherwise metaphors or methods? Because what I think of is that you find in the mathematical formulation a very sort of suggestive idea about the form of the analysis, the structure of the analysis, I should say. So there's a kind of analogy between the form of analysis which you carry out when you give me that case, and the structure, these mathematical structures. So, but then the mathematical structures become very precise metaphors. But they're nonetheless your method of social analysis. I don't know. I mean, is there that distinction, or am I making a mistake?
Well, historically, this mathematical stuff is used to solve a mythical problem. And the mathematical method, I take it as it is, with all validation white. Because if you put the data on this formulation, and if you put in whatever way that you put them, if they yield not equal, but not wrong, false, or if they yield, this is a proof that I am right. Why? Because I know that these mathematical models are proved scientifically. It is not metaphor.
No, the model's not metaphor. In terms of the mathematics, they're not metaphors.
Yeah.
But in terms of the social analysis, is there an analogy between the validated mathematical models and the structure of your social analysis?
It is not an analogy. It's a mathematically validated. It is a mathematical validation. Why? Because the catastrophe model were born to solve concrete problems. As far as I remember, but maybe Arthur will know better, at 72, René Thom proved for the first time the catastrophe model in studying the embryon in biology. And after that, just for the sake of history, one of the students of René Thom was also student of Lévi-Strauss, and he, Jean Petitot, he discovered, or he make known to the world, that what Lévi-Strauss was doing was an anticipated of catastrophe model discovered by René Thom, which was in 72, translated in 78 into English. So by this time, Lévi-Strauss has finished his work. So, but this mathematical model, which is used exactly, it was an anticipation. Well, we know now that Lévi-Strauss was a genius before the mathematicians. So this, after 72, or mostly after 78, everybody now is convinced that this method is valid mathematically. So, don't ask me why it is valid mathematically. I'm not so such a genius to do, but I don't doubt that. That is.
Okay, one more question.
Very closely related question with data load here at the center. I mean, also listening to your current answer to this question, I mean, I'm a great fan of Harrison White, identity and control, network analysis, and culture. So I really keep asking myself, what would be the, if you accomplish this, let's assume you have a data set, indexes, students, mathematical correlations, what would then be the result be different than, say, if it was an analysis done by a cultural sociology and just looking at the meaning-making patterns of European identity or identities or identification?
The result, I expect, I hope, the result would be a measurement instrument to predict, not to predict, but to help decision maker. Because this kind of research can be repeated longitudinally. And the way how, so it can be something similar to meteorological instrument. Some to predict, if we have that and that and that and that, we must expect that. So how to prevent or how to promote? This is the hopeful outcome.
Okay, well, on that hopeful note, we're out of time. So thank you, Albert, for being willing to take the first slot and for a very stimulating talk.
Thank you.